Merion Historical Society, and I thank Robert Paul, who is here somewhere. You're in front of me. Thank you. You're right in front of my nose. Who suggested this as a story that we would all want to hear. Okay.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having us here. My name is Brad Up. I am from Lower Merion. I live in Gladwyne on Contract State Road. I grew up right over here, and if you can imagine being in Conshohocken over here and taking a photograph, if you're familiar with River Road, the VFW would be right around here. Waverly Road would wind down here, and the Schuylkill Expressway would ride right along here, right above the Reading Railroad. And what you're looking at is a photograph, the only known photograph of what was Camp Discharge. Now, up here, there's the Philadelphia Country Club, but this predates that, obviously. And these are buildings, barracks, and there's a much sharper picture, which I'll show you in a few minutes. But essentially, this picture. Okay, first I should go back and say, in 1979, I was 10 years old, and I was reading the Mainline Times. And there was a guy named Uncle Ben Kramer who would write historical pieces in the newspaper. And I read, and in that issue that week was about Camp Discharge. Now, he had to meet a deadline. So like many of the sources we scoured over, it was a general vague idea of where camp, like it was from here all the way over to Spring Mill Road, where the, where we'll call this, we're talking about it.
Yeah.
The nature center. Riverbank. Okay, so anyway, so basically it was shaded all the way in. And of course, some of the details, we were talking about the ghost of Camp Discharge, but it was intriguing. And as it turns out, myself and a bunch of other kids that lived on Lafayette Road, we played up here. It was just a meadow. There was an old house. Let's give you a little bit sharper image of it. Okay, here we go. Now you can really see. And by the way, what's interesting is that the Historical Society and a lot of other places with limited information thought it was a bunch of tents, a couple guys up there in tents. As you can see, it was much more of a going concern. Some thought it was Confederate prisoners that built all the stone walls throughout the area. There is no evidence of any of that. But what you're looking at here, this is your perimeter fence. This is Joseph Kirkner's property, which he leased to the Army per year. And they came up here and basically put this camp right in the spot, which was his property line, which has this perimeter fence that's 12 feet high. Here's an interior fence that ensconces the camp 12 feet high. Here are two-story barracks. There's a hospital over here. There's a hospital over there. These are the officers' quarters up top. Here's the 100-foot flagpole that can be seen from Philadelphia. So you can see it was a rather large encampment. Now, what I should say is, when we started, Jerry Francis, former president of the Lower Merion Historical Society, great man, asked me to start looking into making a pamphlet about Camp Discharge. So I was like, sure, that'd be great. And I started to look around. I went to the Pennsylvania State Archives Historical Society on Locust Street, where I was hoping to find something. I ran into a guy. He was there once a month, University of Virginia. He's a Civil War guy. And I said, listen, I've been to the Athenaeum. I've been all over the place. I'm looking for anything on this Camp Discharge. He's like, let's go take a look in the card catalog. I was like, okay, let's go. He said, evidently we have a picture of it. I was shocked. I was overwhelmed. So I was like, that's awesome. Let's go. So I filled out all the stuff. I was waiting. And then the intern comes down and drops a picture in front of me. And it's not this one. I was like, this isn't it. This is 197th Pennsylvania outside of, in Cook County, Illinois, at another camp. You know, and I said, this, he's like, well, that's what was there. And I said, okay. So I like slunk away, and the Civil War guy said, hey, how was it? Did you see it? I was like, I don't think it's the right picture. He said, so he gets up and gets involved. He goes over and grabs the intern, who's not terribly excited to be there. He's just there to get the credits. I know, I'm familiar with this. And he said, you need to go back upstairs and search all the bins surrounding the bin that you found that in. So 20 minutes later, that kid comes out and drops that former picture right in front of me. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, all right, finally, there is visual evidence of this. Now, that was an incredible moment. And I immediately contacted Jerry Francis. He had this enhanced picture created, which gives you a really good idea of what we're looking at. So down here's Joseph Kirkner's farmhouse, although he didn't live in it. His farm manager did. He lived on the other side of the river in Conshohocken. This is the spring house, and then the barn is buried behind these trees. Now here's another great discovery. This is the blueprint of Camp Discharge, designed by John MacArthur Jr., renowned architect in Greater Philadelphia. You may know City Hall. That's one of his designs. He never lived to see its completion, but he was the guy who put it together. Now this gives you kind of a footprint of what we were looking at from an angle over here. Here's the Schuylkill River. Here's where the Reading Railroad would be. River Road went from Philadelphia basically all the way and wrapped into Conshohocken, Matson Ford area. And this is the quadrangle of the camp. Now this was also a random find. So Jim and I, again, courtesy of the Historical Society, went to Washington, D.C. on several trips together. I should say that Jerry Francis introduced us because Jim has written, he's an acclaimed writer. And so we were put together and we started making this trip to DC. The second trip down there, I was lamenting the fact that I don't know who knows where the blueprints are. They weren't in Philadelphia. They weren't in the surplus from the Schuylkill Arsenal. They weren't at the Athenaeum. They weren't anywhere. But there's a cafe at the bottom of the National Archives. I'm sitting there again. I'm like, I don't know what to do, whatever. A guy overhears this conversation and says, have you been to the Annex building in College Park? I said, no. And he said, well, if you get on the shuttle, it'll take you there. And there's a good chance in the land holdings, they'll have this. Next morning, I got on the shuttle. It was this rickety thing that literally felt like it was going to fall apart, but I was so excited. I get there, I go in, and I get sent up to this big room. And there's like these blue binders around the entire perimeter of the room. And I'm staring at them like a deer in the headlights, kind of like I was at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And this lady came out and said, "Hey, I help you with something?" I was like, okay, I am looking for the blueprints of a Civil War discharge camp in Pennsylvania in Lower Merion Township. And she's like, what's it called? I was like, Camp Discharge or Camp Spring Mill. There's a couple names, but Camp Discharge is the main name. And she went right over and plucked one of these books out of the sea of book, hundreds of binders. And she said, come back in an hour and it'll be here. I was like, it will? Okay. I was pacing around like I was in a delivery room. I couldn't wait to get back there. I came flying back in, and then this other lady was pushing this giant folder, big gray folder, like the size of that table. And she's like, this is the most interesting thing I've pulled all year. And she put it on the table and flipped it open, and there it was. This is on white muslin cloth. I don't know if you can see, but
how large is it?
It's it's just a little smaller than this, actually. So in addition to this, there were three other blueprints of the building materials, how it was joined together, the barracks. So there was a bunch of details that were really fascinating. So this was another huge piece of at least identifying where the camp was. Now, by this time, and I'll get to this later, but the Philadelphia Country Club had allowed me as a non-member to go around and look for things, for evidence, which we'll talk about towards the end. But now this will give you you might recognize all of this now. There's the Schuylkill Expressway. Here's Lafayette Road, goes down here. There's Youngsford. Lafayette goes over to Waverly. Conshohocken's up here. The Conshohocken curves up here. And if you're familiar with Riverbend, which is at the end of Spring Mill Road, which turns into Century Lane, and breaks off to the right. This is the Sid Thayer Trail that brings you over to where Camp Discharge was, which is right here. Here's Martin's Lane. But this basically gives you can go there, walk around, and see the area. There's not much to see officially. If you want, the only known structure that still exists is the sentry box. So you're going towards Riverbend, the country club's on your right, you wind your way down, and Century Lane breaks off to the right, and there is the original sentry box, which the citizens that live on Century Lane maintain this. Everything was auctioned off at the end of the war, and this was given back to Howard Wood as a gift, and he took it probably from over here and put it here, which is where his driveway was. So anyway, that's a basic overview of the camp as we know it. Now Jim is going to take over, esteemed colleague.
Thanks, Brett. So yeah, hi folks. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the camp and what it was all about, why it was there, who were the soldiers who went there, give you kind of the basics. But first, yeah, just thanks for having us. This is very exciting. I live very close. This is my home library. We've given a talk at other libraries around the township. It's very exciting to be here. And I've been to some of the talks here as well. So anybody know what we're looking at? This is a well-known image. It's not a pop quiz.
It's cheap because I read.
You read the book.
I read the book.
What battle happened in Pennsylvania?
Gettysburg.
And what was the culmination of the Battle of Gettysburg? A very famous
Pickett's Charge.
Pickett's Charge. You're seeing Pickett's Charge come in from the right and crash into the Union defenders right in the middle there at what's called the Bloody Angle. You see the stone wall there. It was hand-to-hand deadly combat. A bunch of men who made their way later to Camp Discharge fought right there. Brad is a reenactor for the 69th. They were right there at what was called the Bloody Angle. The Philadelphia Brigade, the 69th, the 71st, 72nd, they were right there. In a huge moment in history. And somewhere, almost 100 of them later made their way to Camp Discharge.
This is a painting?
Sorry?
Is it a painting?
It's an engraving. It was very well known. You see big images of it in different history museums, done soon after the war, actually. So the men at Camp Discharge fought at Gettysburg. They fought at all the other famous battles of the war. They fought at Bull Run. They fought at Fredericksburg. They fought at Antietam. They fought at the Wilderness. They fought in Nashville. They fought in some of them, even in the March to the Sea down in Georgia. Most of them were attached to the Army of the Potomac. Most of them who came to Camp Discharge were what would be called 3-year men, right? We know our Civil War, 1861 and 1865. These were men who, by and large, had signed up pretty quickly in the early months of the war for 3-year enlistments. So 1864 comes, their time is up. Some of them re-upped, but most of them wanted out. They'd been through hell and back. They'd given their pound of flesh and more. Their families wanted them back. They wanted out, and it was time. The military recognized that they had to be prepared to muster out these men. They were getting reinforcements, so they, could afford to do that. But these men deserved to be out. And so the way the Army, just for a moment, it helps to know this, why the camp was established. This was did not pre-exist the war. The camp discharge was only established in 1864 to handle a set of these soldiers who were coming out of the military or needing to be processed. So that's why Camp Discharge was set up, and it belonged to the Army's eastern jurisdiction of Pennsylvania, which means if your regiment was mustered in, was trained in eastern Pennsylvania and mustered in administratively in eastern Pennsylvania, then you would be mustered out administratively through eastern Pennsylvania. And so the camp served regiments from eastern Pennsylvania. It served a subset of soldiers. We found there were 89 regiments who had men at Camp Discharge. The regiment's about 1,000 men. There were nowhere there were 89,000 men going through Camp Discharge. Our laborious piecing together of the names on the roster sheets had only a little more than 1,100. That's because, and that's what makes Camp Discharge so fascinating, it was for the folks, the men who have been separated from their regiments through one circumstance or another during the war. They were, you might call them stragglers through no fault of their own. Three main categories. Sometimes they had been simply sent to another regiment where they needed you because of your skills. You might be a teamster, you might be a sharpshooter, maybe they just needed some men and they shipped you laterally to another regiment. You still belonged to your original regiment and needed to go through that administrative process. So the rest of your regiment, you could picture it as the war went on, would be who knows where while you're back here moving around with another. So you would make your way back to Philly, the main eastern jurisdiction mustering office was in Philly, and report and be sent up to Camp Discharge. This camp that is handling stragglers like you. You might be traveling alone, you might be with a cohort of men. So some of the men, again, have been sent because they needed, you were needed in another regiment. Other men were held back because they had been wounded or they were sick and they were waylaid in a hospital down south as the Union captured territory would set up medical facilities for its men. There were a lot of them around Nashville, for instance, but other places as well. So you might have been recuperating while your comrades are off there and you're back. So again, you would be sent up to Philly and then up to Camp Discharge while they figured out your paperwork. The main category, again, there were three of them. The big category was you had been captured and you were a POW, released from one of the Confederate prison camps. There were a lot of them, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. So again, they would make their way to Philly, either in their little cohort or individually. They would be sent to the mustering office, report, say, I am, Private Jones. I came out of Andersonville. I was captured on this date. There'd be somebody there in the office would take your story and give you a pass. You'd hop on the train. You saw the train there. There was a siding at the bottom of the hill where you get off and make your way up to the camp. Report there and be assigned to a barracks and wait while the mustering office, and picture how this would have happened back then. I mean, there was no texting, no emailing, and nothing like we have now. You'd have telegraph, but they would have couriers. That certainly would be the system. And they would track down where your original regiment, again, that you belonged to, was. Sometimes they had already been dissolved. So you would find where the officers were and get their paperwork. Find out, did you have a Private Jones in Company D? Was he captured on May 16th, 64 in the wilderness? And that was a very common circumstance. And yes, that all squares. Okay, he is owed, his last payment was on this date. He is owed X amount of money. And so they would then reconcile your paperwork and give you your discharge paper, your pay, your bonus if you were entitled to a bonus, a bounty. Sometimes they would be entitled to bounty. And an officer would go from the mustering office on the train up to the camp summon you from your barracks or wherever, hopefully you were still in your barracks, and have a ceremony, and you would be off. Some of them would immediately want to hop a train. It would also come with a train pass to get you closer to home, and they would be off. Some of them would celebrate, and there's stories about going into Philly and buying suits and, you know, splurging a little bit and then going home and be looking good and happy to be home. So that's what Camp Discharge basically was created for. So Brad and I went to the archives, as he was saying, down in Washington. It's a great experience if you have any reason to want to go and do any research on any military in your own family, and other things too, but that was obviously our purpose. So what you're looking at here is one of the many monthly roster sheets that Camp Discharge generated for the men who reported there to the headquarters. The clerks were reporting, and this is a little hard to see. This is in a large section of part of this, because some of these men were ones who we highlighted in our book. It would have their name, their regiment, their company, the date they showed up. And then we would then take images of these. We have many, many images of these, and then go into regimental histories and the dates. It's this big compendium of all the regiments and all the men, and other sources, and figure out, yes, he's there. And sometimes the spellings were different. The clerk would write a German name and phoneticize it, and it would not be quite proper, but we would figure that out as best we could. And based on that, we came up with 1,119 men who went to Camp Discharge to be discharged. There were also guards up there, but that's a separate category. There were almost half that many guards. They were from 89 regiments. 2/3 of the regiments, by the way, were from Philadelphia. So they were very close to home. But most of the men, you know, in the Eastern jurisdiction were Philly guys. Montgomery County, not so much. There were 58 regiments that had men in Camp Discharge. There were only 5 that had men from Montgomery County. So we researched what did exist. I don't know, and I don't know if you have any theory on why, but it probably depended on the service that those men had. Where those regiments had served and when they'd served accounted for. And I know Montgomery County simply wasn't as populated; it was much more rural. So the men's only purpose was to sit in camp and wait while these couriers and, you know, the administrative folks in the mustering office were was a term for reconciling their paperwork. And so sometimes that would happen quickly and then be gone in a few days. Everything would be worked out. Sometimes it would be months. They were stuck there. And in a minute, we'll talk about how some of them were in bad shape. So as I mentioned, POWs. This is Andersonville. This is not Camp Discharge. This is a well-known horror story of Andersonville, probably the most notorious Confederate prison camp down in southern Georgia. And men just packed in there and just wallowing in the mud and filth and getting all kinds of skin diseases and respiratory diseases, dying at the prime of life. You know, these were young men, and thousands of them died. Huge cemetery down there for them. This picture this fellow over here, his name is Philip Hatzel. He was a survivor of Andersonville. I have his picture there just to show what kind of bad shape a lot of these men were in. Not all of them were, they hadn't been there as long, but Hattel was a horrible case. He made his way as far as Annapolis, Maryland, and died. When they finally were letting men out of Andersonville, some went up the Mississippi and, you know, curved around back to Pennsylvania, and there's stories about that and some tragedies involving that. A lot of them just made their way overland to the Atlantic coast, and there was Union-held territory there. They would have medical facilities there to stabilize them, and then they'd put them on ship transports and take them up to Annapolis, Maryland, which had a big military hospital, and there they would be you know, given more nutrients and evaluated. And in this case, that's where this photo of Philip Hattel was taken. He died. Annapolis who didn't make it north. He was from White Marsh. Yeah, so just horrible, gut-wrenching stuff. So I had the number in here of 4 in 10 of the men who came to Camp Discharge had been POWs. 492 of them. We were able to piece together, that full number and double check it against databases. 3 in 10 had been Andersonville survivors. 331 men. And so they had seen, horrible things there, and maybe been in a tent with a few others trying to survive and lost comrades right there. So they were, you can imagine how traumatized they were. Many of them went right into what the camp called its hospital. So I think of them as more as like a infirmary. They were not doing surgery, and it was not, serious high-level care, but they were doing what they could for the men, stabilizing them at Camp Discharge. And so, speaking of medical care, this is again something called a prescription book from the National Archives that they have for Camp Discharge. It's remarkable we're able to find this. Written probably by a clerk. Doctors don't write like this, right? Can I vouch for you? Beautiful script there. This is a book that showed what treatment was being given. The men's name is over here, and I just I have many photos of this. If anybody's a medical person, I can share many images. Sorry?
Can you just read like a little bit out loud as an example, because I can't see.
Yeah, well then I'll get to
Oh,
that.
okay.
So I wanted to point out that you're looking there at a man named Joseph Corson on the top. He was one of the medical doctors at the camp, assigned to the camp, a young fellow. Corson is a well-known Quaker name in Plymouth Meeting and longtime settlers and residents of Pennsylvania. His dad was a doctor. He was a doctor. His kids were doctors, all the way down to Ann Corson, who's a doctor today, and she has his memoir and shared it with me. So that's Joseph Corson. He wrote about what bad shape a lot of his memoir in his memoir. I don't think I can even read it well enough, but we have stuff in the book. But I will tell you a little bit since you're asking. The conditions the men were arriving in was many cases of smallpox, many cases of typhoid, tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, scurvy, all the goodies, skin infections, a lot of rampant skin infections, and a lot of VD. That young drummer boy at the bottom there was there as a guard, or in the guard, patrol, and he got VD, and he shows up on one of the medical books as reporting to camp for that.
Did they report trauma at all, or no?
Well,
Not in those
you would
days.
think many of them were suffering that. No, they did not know
Yeah, I would think it would be
PTSD back then.
reported.
It was unknown. They didn't even have, by World War I, they were calling it like shell shock. They didn't have anything to categorize things as a psychological problem, nothing like nerves or that sort of thing, but that it was rampant. So the treatments that they gave also is very interesting. And we interviewed some Civil War medical folks to get a good idea of that. And then they would often over-treat them with things like mercury, often for VD. There was a saying, a nighttime was Venus, a lifetime was Mercury.
Oh, they die.
Yeah, which is sort of funny, but not really. And they would give them opium, they would give them arsenic for certain treatments. They had the idea of the germ theory of disease had not really come into taken hold in the US. It was in Europe more than not here. They still had this idea of miasmatic diseases, bad air. And they would treat people often with not enough medicine or bomb them with too much medicine. They have this idea of altering the course of a disease. Today we think of alternative medicine. They call it alterative medicine. They would alter the course of the disease by sort of shocking your system by trying to remove the liquid from your body. They would have like urinating, till you were dry, sweating, not bleeding. I know from bleeding from earlier, I don't think bleeding was still happening, but treatments that were not really effective.
And there's something there that says ginger diaphoretic. That's being given for a number, it says there.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you can read it from my angle.
I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
diaphoretic
I can't.
means to make you sweat.
Yeah, to sweating,
Yeah.
yeah, sweating. So, just to give you an idea, the medical care was still,
I
you
just
know,
find it
pretty
primitive.
primitive.
Yeah.
It hadn't really hit the modern understanding.
That's good.
And also to point out, one of the reasons Camp Discharge was at this unusual location, middle of nowhere on a hillside carved out of the woods, was because of public fear of contagion. You know, public was proud of its soldiers, but afraid of its soldiers too. Probably some of them were killers, you know, they were just worried they were going to be uncivilized, but also they were carrying diseases. So Camp Discharge is an isolated location, at least in part for that reason. Yeah, you might say, yeah. So here's a picture of the commandant of the camp. His name, believe it or not, is John Hancock. Right, John Hancock. He's the kid brother of a famous Civil War general, Winfield Scott Hancock.
Oh, yeah.
They were a Norristown family. General Hancock was one of the heroes of, illustrious generals at Gettysburg. So there's John. He distinguished himself in battle too, but then he angled to get himself posted as commandant at Camp Discharge. These are not pictures of the camp, but one of his focuses, it was interesting to read up on the correspondence. He very much wanted to dress up his parade ground at Camp Discharge for a dress parade. And this is a picture that, you know, not again of Camp Discharge, but what he had in mind. And he might have been able to get the guards to do it, but a lot of soldiers I expect would have been reluctant to do that or in no shape to do it. So he would grade, you know, it was very uneven terrain up there. There are accounts of him bringing up carts and horses and having them go and help level out the ground to have his parade, Sunday parade. He had special accommodations with the railroad, have an excursion train come up on the weekends to have the public come and, you know, witness it. And it didn't really do very well and they had to cancel it. He had this brass cannon at the bottom. It's called a Napoleon. He had a couple of those set up up there at the camp, the parade ground. He also hired a band to come and play, probably, you know, for that outside musicians. So that was one of his focuses. He was, you know, I think an effective commandant, but he had this kind of image of a shiny camp that didn't really pan out. And so again, these are not from Camp Discharge, but just generic pictures of soldiers back then and killing time. They had a lot of downtime. They'd have, you know, make work to go and collect firewood or help grade the parade route. But they'd play cards and there was always a worry about soldiers going AWOL and not coming back. They were close to home, like I said, you know, somebody from Philly. They needed to be there for morning roll call the next morning. So they were allowed to go and there was carousing happening in Norristown or Spring Mill, you know, hitting the taverns. There were some AWOL. So this picture on the right is a guardhouse in Brig where they would throw men who had been AWOL and, you know, captured again.
Have any that are actual photos that they have from then have any that might be their living relatives now? Have they been identified, or is that something that a person would have to go for themselves?
You'll hear because we did make contact. Brad particularly had quite a bit of success. You're talking about men who were at Camp Discharge?
That they're identifiable
Oh, yeah.
photos. Or
Yeah, definitely. So let me just get to the last days of the camp. So as Brad mentioned, it was closed and auctioned off. So Camp Discharge really existed for only a little more than a year. You know, an intense year, but a little more than a year. Its peak was in the spring of '65. You know, right around when the war was ending and the gates were being thrown open and soldiers were, you know, moving up. And then it remained open through the summer. And certainly the hospital was needed. There were a lot of men who weren't shaped yet to be released. And then finally in the fall, they mothballed it. They just had a garrison guard just hold down the fort, so to speak. And then finally in the winter, they came and inventoried what was there and had a huge auction up there where people came up and bought all the various pieces of the camp, literally pieces of the camp. So there you see the fourth item is a sentry box. Remember, we saw a picture of the sentry box. But carpenter's bench and a pot and a meat table and hundreds of thousands of floorboards and nails and shingles and everything. And so we know from records that some of the materials ended up in Conshohocken, in West Conshohocken. That picture over on the right is a place called Balagomingo Mills up in West Conchi. And they bought some of the buildings, as did another mill up there. But they also bought the flagpole. Remember, Brad mentioned that landmark flagpole. And they had it, there's an engraving of it. And it was there for about a decade until it caught fire. There was a fire at the mill and it got the flagpole as well. So we're lucky to have that one picture of it. So in terms of the men, yes, we definitely wanted to make this a history of the individuals. So we, in the book, we have 15, 16 profiles of kind of a cross section of the men who were there. And we have many, many more photos of men who were there as well. But we dug into 15 or 16 of them. And again, they're in the book, but here's 3 of them just to give you a sample. This man on the left, his name is Albert Thalheimer, German Jew, came with his family to Philly. And this is a picture of him later in life, that he, as a young man, enlisted, went off to war, was captured, went to Andersonville, lost half of his body weight. He wrote about that. Came back, was an entrepreneur, went up to Reading, reestablished in Reading, had some businesses. One of his thriving businesses was making cigar boxes. But he always remembered his fellow vets and reached out and he lobbied on their behalf. And with Congress, he set up a monument on Mount Penn, which is a prominent spot in Reading. And he hired vets to be working at the factory to do what they could. So that's Thalheimer. He's kind of a success story. This man in the middle, handsome young fellow, his name is Hayes Swisher, Edward Hayes Swisher. He also at Andersonville got a horrible case of scurvy that he never really shook. He made it back. Went up to the oil region in northwestern PA and worked there as best he could, but there are accounts of him just struggling mightily, and he died young. By the way, we know all this because another great resource at the National Archives is pension paperwork for the Civil War soldiers. So if you later had health problems, you could apply for what was called an invalid pension. It was a new thing for the government to be doing that. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was something for these men. So in order to get it, they'd have to make a case. So they would have affidavits from their doctor, from their neighbor, their spouse, their boss, about what life was like for them, what their conditions were. So that's a very rich picture. Also, for some of them, these would have, the doctor's reports would have an image of a man. I'm doing this because it'd be like a drawing of a man, just a body. And it would have marked on there where the wounds were. You could see a hole here, or like the arm is gone, and they would put a line across it. So very graphic as well. So that's how we were getting a lot of this information. And then in some cases we could reach out to people. We also were getting it from regimental histories, would have information about individuals as well and their movements through the war. The man on the right was a real find for Brad. And you want me to talk about that? You want to talk about it? It's up to you. Okay. Up to me. You're still rolling? I'm rolling. Okay, I'm rolling. So, his name is Isaac. What's he? Horner. Horner. Thank you. I'm thinking of Isaac Hayes. No, Isaac Horner. And so Brad happened to, the way it works in the archives, you ask for pension papers and it's all indexed, so they have it on an individual soldier. Only one person can look at those at a time, sign it out, and these are invaluable, and there have been problems with people snitching and stuff. So you were assigned a seat and you get it and you sign it in, you sign it out. I'm here, Brad's there. I'm not even allowed to go sit beside him while he's looking at it. So in any case, he was the one who had this one. We went down with about, I don't know, 15 or 20 names and men who we wanted to zero in on. So Isaac Horner's opened up and pictures fall out of it, which was remarkable. And a set of, this is just one of them. Isaac Horner had enlisted, and he actually had gone to Andersonville as well. He came back to Camden. You know, you didn't need to live in your county or your exact area where your regiment had been mustered in. People would come in based on the timing was right for them, or they were they wanted to be in the cavalry and then jump over 2 counties and sign up there. That was fine. So he was from Camden, but he had signed up with the Pennsylvania regiment. So he comes back, he goes back, he's got a wife and a passel of kids. And in no time at all, he abandons them. And he hops a train, says, don't try to find me, you won't be able to find me. And he leaves a note. And he ends up in out west, which at that point was Ohio. But he restarted his life out there, living with the family where he was a worker, almost a member of the family as well. So long story short, he dies, and the folks in Ohio go through his possessions, and they find that he had a whole other life that he had never talked about and they did not know about, with the address of the wife and all that. And so they write and they send these pictures back to the wife, and saying, you know, telling what they understood and what had happened. And so they actually had a correspondence, the wife and this, I think it was one kind gentleman from Ohio. So this was actually, now that I'm saying it, this was actually in the widow paperwork with these photos when she was applying then for a widow pension. She had approved, and she, you know, she had never really seen it, but she had these photos to establish that that was indeed her husband. So it's intense, these stories, and we have a number of them in the book to try to bring this to life. And I'll turn this back to Brad in a minute, but I just want to say we've given 20-some talks up and down the Eastern PA and in Philly and all. When we go, we try to pull together a list of the men from that locality where we're speaking to give them the names of men. Maybe they knew about these men, maybe they didn't. If nothing else, we could maybe add some richness to the story that they did not have. And that's been a meaningful thing, certainly for me and for Brad too. So yeah, it's been really good to work with Brad. This is a passion for him, and he's kept at it with tracking down people and pictures, and we have many of them. The Lower Merion Historical Society has a section of their website that has more. So Brad can tell you why he's pretending he's a grave digger here and what's going on. So why don't you take us home?
So what you're looking at here, if you imagine looking up that hill on that picture, this is the lower tier of the camp, and this is a latrine. It's a regulation latrine. It's 12 feet long, 5 feet wide, 10 feet deep. I'm 6'4.5". That's every bit of 10 feet. I dug out 2 of these, which is now what I need to go back and say is the Philadelphia Country Club. Initially, when Jerry Francis had reached out, and he's the kind of guy who can get things done, and we were rebuffed over and over again. Then we got a telephone book size contract or set of rules and regulations, which basically means that I could go to Camp Discharge on the Sioux Thayer Trail and look over. But some things happened. Some people knew some people inside the country club. Next thing you know, we're sitting down at the table with the vice president of the club. And I said, what I need to do is get in there and see if I can't find some evidence. Now that we know where it is. I bought my first metal detector in 1994 in Richmond, Virginia. And I wandered around near Camp Discharge, Keneally Park. I was like behind the Stony Lane Swim Club. You know, I was too afraid to go in the country club for fear of being arrested immediately. And so once I got in there, and this is very forbidden ground, just like we talked about this, they've carved this up, like they crowbarred this camp into this hillside. It's as many rocks, That's the dirt pile. On the other side is a huge mound of rocks. Now, the stuff, you know,
You excavated.
yeah, bought every scrap of it. And I have to say, here's some artifacts. These are surface finds from around the camp. There's some of them are in that. Oops, I'm sorry. Some of them are in the display case. These bottles came out of the bottom of the latrine in the use layer, which is basically right here, which you can imagine what that was. Of course, it's perfectly safe to be around now, I hope. And one of the most interesting things I found in the latrine was an eyeglass lens. So I would fill those buckets up and I had a rope and I'd pull them up, dump them out, look for anything in there. And I dumped a bucket on it. I saw this thing rolling down the dirt. And I go, that's an eyeglass lens. So then, of course, I'm imagining the guy, it's late at night. This is like a string of Johnny on the spot to the Eagles game. Like 5 guys could go in there. Late at night with the lantern. Anybody who wears glasses knows that the lens can pop out from time to time. And, you know, after I've slept in them a couple times, sat on them, you know, so I picture him getting in there and it like dances around on the hole and then just drops out of sight. Never to be seen again until 2019. And I took it to my eye doctor and he said, this is a very well-ground piece of glass for a farsighted person. And it's one of my favorite finds. Now, if you look around on this thing, here's one of the 5 or 6 wedding rings that I found up there. One of which I believe probably belonged to Isaac Horner, if we're going with that story. See you later. But I think they slipped off in the cold weather. Who knows? That's the great mystery. When you find an artifact, you want to put the story together. Like this stuff hadn't been seen since basically 1864 or 1865. And so you can see there's camp stuff here. There's a fork, spoon, pipes, you know, bayonet, scabbard tip, all kinds of things, the stuff that you would have in the Army of the United States at that time. And like I said, the country club has been very gracious. Once we broke through, they were afraid I was going to find a body. That was their biggest concern. And like they wanted to kind of remain autonomous away from any kind of publicity, I guess, would be the thing. And I assured him, I was like, they leased this property. This place was like, they had a tight operation. By the late war, anybody who was bravely ill, for the most part, was taken into Philadelphia to die there. Although 3 people from our research died at Camp Discharge. One of them is particularly interesting to me. It was Calvin Morrison from Norristown. And he was 19 years old. He'd been in Andersonville. And he just disappeared. He was buried nearby. Now, there's an old Quaker burial ground right on Youngsford Road that was removed when the Johnson family bought that property. They took them over to other Quaker in Haverford, the Llewellyn Cemetery. They were a family that owned almost all of what is Camp Discharge now. Before they sold it off, you know. And I will say this, if the Philadelphia Country Club didn't own this, this would be a sea of houses as far as the eye can see. That would connect Martin's Lane to Spring Mill. So now, as Jim mentioned, I know some of us are trying to get out. Oh, by the way, there was 1 vote cast in 1864 for Abraham Lincoln from Camp Discharge, as it turns out, and 1 absentee ballot from there. But this continues. I continue to find the grave sites of all these people, any kind of images. So on the Lower Merion Historical Society website, this is an ongoing project. Like this winter, with the permission of the country club, I will return there until they pull the plug. I always am like, so is it possible for me to return this year? And they've been very gracious and great champions.
Mention the
signs. I was going right to that. So in this, they've also been extra enthusiastic and gracious to put some signage up there. So if you go on the Sid Thayer Trail, whether you come up from Martin's Lane or come from Riverbend, up at the 4th green, which is basically right in the middle of the parade ground, we are getting a 2-sided sign made there. And then down at the barn, or that lower part of the camp, we are hoping to get a tabletop sign that basically shows you not only the image of the camp, the picture, the blueprints and where you're standing. And hopefully, within this next, by springtime, hopefully we will put those signs in once they get manufactured. And then my Civil War regiment, along with others, will go and dedicate these signs. Now, and as you can see, I got into this because now Uncle Ben Kramer was interesting. But then I read my great-great-great-grandfather's diary, and that's what kicked off the Civil War interest. The other great-great-great-grandfather survived Andersonville. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here. I obviously don't look like I was in Andersonville at all. I look more like Albert Thalheimer years later. But it's a fascinating story. There's still more to learn. We live in a very historic area. There's lots of interesting things to get involved in. So I know we're approaching 8 o'clock. Some of us are trying to, get into this debate tonight. So we would like to do a Q&A.
Yeah, are we okay with that?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, there's YouTube. If you have DVRs, they'll be showing it on, I'm sure. I mean, whatever.
Yeah, but if you want to get up and leave, we will not be
crestfallen or upset.
Do we have any concept of whether any of these people stuck around in our area once the camp closed?
Well, a number of them were from, Philly and environs, but in terms of stayed right around the camp, not that I'm aware of at all.
Joseph Corson is buried in West Laurel Hill. He's the camp physician.
Yeah, that's right. His family was.
And there was a kid who grew up down on Waverly Road who was only 13 or 14, and he was like the camp, go grab this kind of guy. And then he lived right, basically down where I grew up, and would come up to the camp and they'd give him little tasks. He also was on the hospital record.
Yeah, I got a question. So you said there was a siding basically on Reading Railroad line when they got discharged. Did that exist beyond that, or it only existed for the purposes of getting them to the?
It existed for the purpose of getting to the camp. Yeah, there was another one a little farther up, where Spring Mill Road would take you down.
Okay.
But that was a separate, more of a fixed station. Yeah, this was just for that purpose.
But this was also used by Wood, it was called the Woodmere stuff also, which the late Frank Weir, who was a great historian in railroad history in the area, grew up or spent his summers at the top of the camp on the Keach Farm, which was right next door to the Kirkman place. And he took a picture of what was Woodmere Station in the 30s, which the Wood family used, which I think is probably pretty much the same location where this Camp Discharge, there was a sign, love to find that, that indicated, just a little, there were a couple of stops. Spring Mill Station, Lafayette Station, Mill Creek Station on Mill Creek Road.
Yeah, but the remarkable thing is how briefly Camp Discharge was even there. It's really like a year and a half and it was gone.
Was it mandatory to go to Camp Discharge?
If you wanted to get your proper discharge papers and your final pay, you had to go through the administrative procedures. Otherwise, you were deserting and you were still in service. So,
And did other states have the same setup?
That's a big, that's the question we get every time. And we have no actual knowledge of other camps. Just as random and off the chart, undocumented as this was, we had to dig hard for all this. Every scrap was hard earned, nothing jumped off the page. I bet there are, and they're just as obscure as this one was. Now you have your big camps, the Cadwalader down in Philadelphia was huge camp, and that was used during, war, and then after, it was also a discharge spot. This is the only one we know of officially that would resemble.
set up for this purpose. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. Like Brad saying, it's like the $100,000 question. Today, I reached out to this one scholar who's a scholar of the demobilization of the Union Army. I haven't been able to reach him through several outreach. I figure if anybody would know, he would. because it's so logical. Of course, this was a category of soldier that would be everywhere in, New York and Jersey and Wisconsin and whatever. This is the only one called Camp Discharge, and nobody has ever written about other, specialty camps to handle stragglers like this, but it stands to reason they had to be elsewhere. They might have repurposed or expanded their existing training facilities, like in Harrisburg, there was something called Camp Curtin. Curtin was the governor, so it's named for the governor of the day. That might have handled Western PA, because that was a base in Pittsburgh, for instance, was not. Carlisle was not so much. But that's a hunch, and I don't know about other states, and I keep trying to reach this guy. He must be off on sabbatical writing a book or something. So, good question.
Does the Civil War Museum and Library have anything about Camp Discharge?
We were there.
Yeah.
I mean, in Philly?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Andy
we were
Washby,
there.
if you know Andy Washby, he was instrumental. Now, I've been reenacting with him for 27 years. So,
They were happy we're doing what we're doing.
yeah, he was thrilled. I gave him, I've been to the Union League. I gave him a bullet. I said, here's a piece of Camp Discharge. But he filled in a lot of critical links to bring some of this together. He was a great resource. So we were there. We looked around. I mean, I don't think we got anything specifically from there, but I used to volunteer when it was on Pine Street in the 90s, which was a cool experience. But they are familiar with it, and I'm sure they have a copy of the book.
Yeah, we spoke.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a tiny bit off, but a cafe was mentioned. There's a kid near the National Association.
Oh, the cafe, in the National Archives, it's in the basement.
Okay, so there's a cafe in the basement of the National Archives?
Yeah, like a place to get lunch, where you're during the
If you're
day.
there all
And
day doing
anybody could
research.
go?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a people's.
These things
archive.
belong to us. We, the people, can go in there. I mean, they shake you down. You can go in there. But they have this little cafe, it's in the basement of the facility, and it's,
The National Archives, where is that located?
It's on Pennsylvania Avenue.
in DC.
The front of it, it faces
It's on the mall. You're
is-
talking about the National
The
Mall?
mall side is the big grand, Greek temple look. And that's where you go up the steps and you go into the holy space with the Declaration of
Right.
Independence and the kids, school kids coming through. The National Archives is on the back side of it. Literally, you gotta go around the back. and
Yeah,
it's down the bottom,
Constitution
but
Avenue.
Then it opens up into
That's where it is.
one of those sides.
Yeah.
But just to give you an idea. And the back side is Pennsylvania Avenue. So,
Okay, and there was a cafe there. Okay, great.
Yeah.
You're right.
Have you been to Harrisburg?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I'm
The archives.
curious. You didn't mention anything about.
Yeah, we went to
You
Carlisle.
go to the tower, you go to the tower in Harrisburg, and there's just all kinds of strange stuff in there.
Sure, like we went all over the place, the Gateway Museum, we went to Carlisle, we made it, like, this was like I said, this is a real journey.
It's fun to do. If you have a.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I might have mangled it, but I was intrigued by the story of the reconciliation. Like, how do they verify the soldier was with a particular regiment? And like, how many people were involved in this sort of like sleuthing of like, is this
I don't
story
know.
legit?
That's a good question. There's no records that we were able to find of like
Someone might know.
who
the
was
guy.
assigned to go,
Yeah, I mean,
and chase down this
huge
guy.
operation.
Some of those guys that showed up that had been AWOL, like they deserted early in the morning.
Yeah, there were a few.
Back-
That's right.
And they got put back into service. If their regiment was still in the field, they were put into another regiment to serve out their time so they could get an honorable
So the
discharge.
story had to check out for them to get
Yeah.
their attention.
Yeah, they cross-referenced them. I mean,
Yeah.
for the time, it's very, very thorough. I mean, the Union Army was light years ahead of the Confederacy as far as organization, record keeping, and keeping it organized. Like Philadelphia was a main hub. There were tons of Civil War everywhere around the city. And so they did their best to be very specific about each individual. And sometimes they know somebody, oh yeah, I know that guy. But with some of that we would speculate. But there might have been some imposters because some of these guys don't check out. Like we put them through and there's no evidence of him being in a regiment, but yet there he is in the hospital record. Not
Could
sure.
have been, the clerk didn't write it down,
Yeah, there's a
right?
couple of weird,
Yeah.
Since you have so many dead there, maybe they're just, all the people who could give evidence were dead.
There's, well, 650,000 people were dead at the end of the war on both, both sides combined, so.
After evidence, fighting afterwards.
Yeah, so, and or just get lost in the annals of history,
It's like COVID.
Right, so and all these records were rewritten in 1907. Because there were fires, like St. Louis had they had a big repository of all these Civil War records, and they would redo them again. And a bunch of them were lost in different fires, which is kind of interesting.
So I have kind of like a two-part question, but first, like from a macro perspective, thank you, and you guys are awesome, and this was so interesting, and I'm so glad to be at like a lecture, but in person. So, so like macro, like big picture here, was this like you guys were like, oh, let's write a historical like thing about this sort of like admin place in a war place that we don't know of any other similar parallel
It was
thing?
more, it's in Lower Merion. Let's do our local history.
Oh.
We find what we found, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the other.
I mean, Jerry
Okay, great.
Francis was a big, like, he wanted us to this was gonna just be a pamphlet. If you go to the Historical Society, there's pamphlets about historical things in the area. And that's what this was gonna be. And then, he brought Jim and I together, and this became a much bigger thing, which I'm thrilled about.
Right.
Because
There's so much context to bring in, to really tell it the full story. And
yeah,
there still are questions, like, were there other ones,
Right.
and why was it
Right.
there, and, yeah. So.
Okay, my other part of the question was, okay, when you were digging out that latrine,
yeah.
so what is, I'm not a historian kind of brain at all, but like, so what was your approach? Was it like, I'll find it, I'll look for anything, and then whatever I find might give me clues to this
Okay.
area, or like,
I've been digging since '94. I got the medal there. I've been done a lot of excavating in Culpeper, Virginia, with these guys down there that know how to dig out these, these settled winter camps, hut sites where they would stay, trash pits. So what I was looking for was I knew there were 9 latrines on the property. But it's only the lower third tier of the camp. The rest is developed by the country with this pristine course. And it was developed in '91. Now, if I'd only had it together in high school, I wasn't even concerned about the Civil War. But that's when it was just a meadow. That would have been the time to really do a thorough archaeological dig. But they have the lower third. I've excavated 2 latrines. And the first one, I was digging, I was metal and saying I was digging, I dug a few rocks on, and then I pulled some more rocks on, and I was like, there's no dirt here. And then I pulled another rock on, and then there was a void. So that we clearly filled in. I started digging some more. I see some ash, some bone. In the other latrine, there was a full donkey, horseshoes and all. And he probably died. And when they were cleaning up the camp, they had 2 companies of people there. They're like, leave it cleaner than you found it. But I dug these 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 feet deep test holes. And with all the rocks, like after about 3 of those, you're like, come on. And but again, I got this flat spot. It was below the barracks. It was a rectangle. I was like, you know what? I bet this is something. So, and I had dug in it before, but I filled it back in because it was so laborious. But at one time, there was a big rock, and I wrenched it out. And once again, you see like these little dark crevices where the dirt falls away into a void, which has clearly been filled in. And then it's happening. And then you're in for 10 feet deep, 12 feet long, 5 feet wide, every bit of it, up to regulation. But what's cool is once you get down to the use layer, which of course is the gray matter, that's where all this stuff had settled, because they would throw lime on top of it every night. They would throw some lime on there to break it down.
right.
And then in that area, these things were preserved. This beautiful medicine bottle, that soda bottle over there, the eyeglass rings, all kinds of stuff,
The Brad's taking volunteers.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this
I'm
is
politely
so
declining.
awesome.
Are there any other?
Why do you make ends from gold?
Sorry, well, oh, no, they're mostly brass rings, with like a silver or gold watch. Probably, I didn't find any, like they were, these guys were mostly working class guys, mostly, you go in the army. Probably not, it was, you didn't walk around having, a lot of gold anything, I think, like a lot of these guys end up dying in obscurity in soldiers' homes in Kansas or Missouri or Ohio. They had no family, they had no money, their little pension would be taken by the soldiers' home, and that's where they would live. I did a big project in Fishtown on Blair Street, Norris Street, which was a Civil War soldiers' home. I mean, it's now 19 condominiums. But when they dug that out to put the new foundations in, I jumped into these holes and there were bottles everywhere. And it was probably from these guys that were growing old at the soldiers' homes. Kind of like a rest home for in the military. Or if you didn't have family to take care of you, that's where you went, destitute. So
thank you, folks. We have books over there.
yes, if anyone's
Have it,
interested.
Getting the gift buying season.